One of the loudest and most common complaints about the Five Nights at Freddy's series is that if you want to know what's going on with the lore of this franchise, there's required reading, and it's a list of like a dozen books. Actually, I guess 23 books. Otherwise, you won't have any clue as to what's going on at these pizzerias. You hear it all the time and it's easy to take it as fact, but is it true? Not really. I attempted to answer that question over a year ago when I made a games-only timeline. Essentially, I took all the lore we could find from each game and only the games, put it on a corkboard, and then tried to make a timeline only using that information. And doing it that way, I had a pretty good idea as to what was going on in this timeline. But I do think without the books, there were some factual errors, not just things that I interpreted differently, just things that were wrong in that timeline. There's key information like Henry's name, Charlotte Emily's name, specifics on how Remnant work, things like that are very important but just don't get specified within the games. So can you make a pretty good timeline without using any books? I think so. But if you want a full and fleshed out timeline to be as accurate as possible, that's where the books really shine. They give us the details that we don't have in game at all. One of the biggest parts about making the timeline that I'm currently trying to make is taking this corkboard and shoving the books onto it. So the biggest question is, which books matter when making a Five Nights at Freddy's timeline? Well, that's what we're here today to start to try and figure out. So Slices, put on your aprons, and let's make ourselves some literary analysis. The way I see it, you can divvy up the books that are relevant into 4 groups. The first being the novels, the Silver Eyes trilogy. The next being Fazbear Frights, a series of 12 books, each comprised of 3 short stories, and most of them have an epilogue, that is one continuous story. The next group would be Tales from the Pizzaplex, similar to Fazbear Frights, a collection of 8 volumes that have 3 short stories and one continuous epilogue. And finally, the Miscellaneous category. This would contain your books like the FNAF Security Logbook, the Freddy Files, the Character Encyclopedia, the Cookbook even, because there's a couple things that seem kind of interesting in there, all the other books that don't cleanly fit into the other 3 categories. So in making this Five Nights at Freddy's timeline, I think it's prudent to take these books and do to them what I did to the games over a year ago. Put them on blast, get every piece of relevant information that I think helps the timeline out of them, and add it to the corkboard. Well, in this case, we'll be making a new separate corkboard and then gluing it to the old one, but you get the idea. This video will be going over all the relevant information I can find in the Silver Eyes trilogy. What are you doing? You're having such a struggle, my guy. Just like chill. Is this what you want? So what are the Silver Eyes books? They're a series of 3 novels written by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed Risley. These books follow a canon adaptation, alternate timeline of the Five Nights at Freddy's story. And before we move on, we do have to have the dreaded conversation: what does canon and continuity mean within the context of Five Nights at Freddy's, and how does Scott use those words? Scott is famously tricky and specific in the words he uses to describe the timeline of the books and games. Traditionally, the word canon refers to events that officially happen within a fictional universe. So, for instance, in canon, Kirby defeats Void Termina, the god of the Jambastion religion, although it is unclear if he's a god or not. Highness declares him as a god, but in interviews the creator of the series says it's not clear. So, canonically, Kirby kills what is essentially a god. However, in that same game, you can play the sub-game The Ultimate Choice, and on Soul Melter EX difficulty, the Void Termina boss fight is replaced with a Void boss fight. Void is omnipresent and exists in every universe in multiple different forms, and it's also a celestial being, but Kirby still kicks its ass. However, this battle takes place within a non-canon sub-game of the game. So while Void is a canon manifestation within these games, Kirby canonically doesn't kick its ass. However, this sub-game does imply that Kirby's able to if he really wanted. Did that make sense? I thought so. Moving on. That's the traditional understanding of the word canon. Scott Cawthon, however, spits in the face of that and refuses to use it as such, because using the English language properly wouldn't effectively troll us, I guess. I don't know. Scott, what is your problem? Scott tends to use the word canon as a replacement for the word official. It's best explained in his post about the Silver Eyes novels. In a Steam post titled "Is the Book Canon?" shortly after the release of The Silver Eyes, Scott wrote, quote, "Something that I should have explained very early on is that the book is not intended to solve anything. It's not intended to be a guide for the games or to fill in gaps. The games are what they are, and as I stated before, that story is finished. Quick aside, I can't believe that Scott himself said the story of FNAF was finished in 2015. You know, like a year after FNAF 1 came out. He continues, "So yes, the book is canon, just as the games are. That doesn't mean they're intended to fit together like two puzzle pieces. Unfortunately for us, literally that's what canon means, is that they are intended to fit together like two puzzle pieces. But it doesn't mean that because Scott is saying it. To Scott, all official Five Nights at Freddy's works are canon. Because to Scott, all canon means is official. What we need to figure out is the other thing he mentioned. Do they fit together? Are they reflections of each other? For the Silver Eyes, Scott directly states no. In the middle of the post, he writes, quote, "The games and books should be considered to be separate continuities, even if they do share many familiar elements." And he closes the post with, "The book is a reimagining of the Five Nights at Freddy's story." So as far as the Silver Eyes go, Scott directly stated that it takes place within a separate continuity from the games. Hopefully Scott will be this clear and direct with every other book in this series. Hopefully. And just to catch everyone up, a continuity traditionally is the consistency of the characteristics of people, plot, objects, and places. A perfect example that many people will know of a canon with multiple continuities are superhero comics. As far as I'm aware, forgive me if I am inaccurate in what I'm about to say, I'm not a huge reader of superhero comics, I just know a lot about them through general osmosis since superheroes kind of took over the popular culture for the past 10 years. But I'm fairly certain that superhero comics have their own multiverses and universes within them. A perfect example would be Spider-Verse. Each Spider-Verse could be considered its own separate continuity. Those continuities can interact and disrupt each other. Each Spider-Verse is their own separate continuity. If you want all this explained in a much more in-depth, thorough, and well-said way, ID's Fantasy actually has a full video on canon, continuity, and the way Scott uses those words. I'd highly recommend that video before moving on to the other book videos. It would help to watch it before you finish watching this video, but please don't click off, it'll fuck up my watch time. Do check out that video before you go to the other book videos though. So to get us back to the Silver Eyes, how do these books inform us about the games? Remember, Scott said it is a reimagining of the Five Nights at Freddy's stories, essentially an alternate universe or an AU, where some people, places, and things that happen might line up exactly with the games, but the events overall are a different story, a what-if scenario. So as far as the Silver Eyes go for useful lore that we should pull from, the safest assumption to focus on are general rules of the universe and people's names and general things that they do. An example, this book is where a lot of our examples of Remnant being directly used come from. Well, not Silver Eyes, but The Fourth Closet, the third book in the trilogy. At some point in this novel trilogy, William takes a molten Goliath he made by melting together the original animatronics and pulls a molten liquid in a syringe out of it and injects it into Funtime Freddy, who then goes and does what he wants. Should we assume this exact scene played out in the games? No, but I think it's very useful to understand that this kind of thing can happen within the FNAF universe. This is a method of obtaining and using Remnant. That's kind of what we'll be looking to do. So without any further ado, what specifically do the Silver Eyes novels tell us? Arguably, the focus of the entire series is on the Emily family, or more specifically, Henry Emily, Charlotte Emily, and their relationships with the Aftons and the Fazbear franchise. In the books, it's established that Henry Emily is co-owner and operator of Fredbear's and Freddy Fazbear's, the other co-owner obviously being William Afton. It's further established that he's the genius behind the technology. He built the Springlock suits and then later even more advanced animatronics. He created a whole bunch of stuff actually. He was just generally a savant with robotics. It's also established in these books that he had two children, Charlotte and Sammy. Presumably Samuel, but we only ever hear the name Sammy. And finally, it's established that at the age of 3, William Afton kidnaps and kills Charlotte Emily. Henry is thrown into a pit of grief and loses his mind, and in that process, his wife and son leave him. In the books, because of this grief, he ends up creating robotic recreations of Charlotte. One as a toddler, a child, a teenager, and an adult. He never finishes the fourth one, and that's later captured by William and turned into Circus Baby. We'll get there later. These robotic animatronic replicas of Charlie were meant to simulate Charlie actually still being alive so she could go on to grow up and Henry wouldn't have lost his daughter. This doesn't work though. He eventually comes to his senses and abandons the whole project, and then later, with grief and guilt, takes his own life. But you might be asking yourself, how would a robot look like a human? Well, that's with the use of illusion discs. So let's talk about those illusion discs, shall we? They feature heavily in the second and third books. They're essentially small chips of technology that emit powerful frequencies that force your mind to have hallucinations. It's basically overloading your senses so your eyes start getting all messed up. The goal of these chips is that once your brain starts hallucinating and isn't sure what's really there, it'll try to fill in the gaps with what's supposed to be there, or at least what your brain thinks is supposed to be there. In the books, it's used to make these beaten up, old, spring-locked, gross-looking animatronics and make them look like approachable characters so they can kidnap children. However, since our main characters know these robots are monsters, they see them as horrifying monsters. Another example being the Charlie bots. The toddler Charlie is built to look like the Ella doll that Henry grieved over, not actually Charlotte Emily. However, once the illusion disc is turned on, if you're looking at something that looks like a small girl and you're expecting to see Charlotte Emily, the illusion disc will make you see Charlotte Emily. The most important thing to note about the illusion discs is what you see depends on who is looking and what they think they're looking at. They are entirely contextual. There are some other notes we learn about them in the books. Illusion discs work on people, but cameras and technology trying to capture it just see a blurry, fuzzy image. And they also have a maximum range. After all, if you can't hear the frequency, the effect doesn't work. Finally, and this is probably the most important lore we get from the Silver Eyes, Remnant, and a little bit of how it works. We get more specific uses of Remnant later on in Fazbear Frights and other stories, but we get a lot of information about it here. Vague information, but information nonetheless. At least a hell of a lot more than what the games give us, which is one actually written out message. And then I guess AR, but AR has some other weird stuff going on. Much of the story of the Fourth Closet involves William Afton using and experimenting with Remnant. Specifically, he melts the original animatronics into one giant behemoth and then extracts the molten metal and flesh mixture and injects it into the Funtime animatronics, essentially turning them into servants. He specifically mainly experiments on Funtime animatronics because he already has some modicum of control over those robots. As he explains, quote, "You can make something that you control completely but has no will of its own, like a gun I suppose. Or you can take a drop of pixie dust and you can create a monster that you mostly control, one with unlimited potential." The idea being, if it's something he mostly controls but can have some will of its own, it can be way stronger and still dominated by him. As far as the substance itself goes, the basic thinking is that with enough heat, you can make the substance malleable enough to manipulate, and that the body of the spirit you're using is necessary in this process. Also, if things look different and the cat swapped, we lost power, so I'm picking up where I left off. A perfect example we get of this in the book is actually Funtime Foxy. And yes, this looks like Mangle. It's Mangle, but the book calls it a mangled Funtime Foxy. And just go with it. But in the book, William tells Foxy to go get a child. And while being able to see the spirits, Carlton then sees Susie, one of the missing child incident kids, go, "Oh, I have to go get this kid for our friend," which also delves into another aspect of spiritual control. William is only able to control these spirits so well because he's convinced them that he is their friend. Once Carlton, while in this spiritual mental realm he's in, is able to convince the children that William Afton was actually the one who killed them, they immediately turn on William and throw themselves and William into the furnace. Hey, why is Carlton in some weird spiritual realm? Great point. In a bit of experimentation, and most likely just a way to try to kill Carlton, William injects Remnant directly into Carlton's heart. He passes out, and William assumes he died, rightfully so, that is molten metal he got his heart injected with. But somehow, instead of dying, Carlton is then in an unconscious state and able to communicate with the kids of the missing child incident, helping them regain their memories and regain control. And miraculously, he's alive alive at the end of the story. It seems as though Remnant causes some sort of healing property, or at least can maintain a body. Some think that this idea of Remnant is how Springtrap is able to stay in one piece, essentially, for so long. This book seems to be implying that Remnant, when injected into a human, can heal that human and allow them to see and communicate with spirits. And I already know some of you are thinking about Michael Afton, someone who was attacked with a Remnant injector, but we'll get there when we get there. And as far as I'm aware, and again, I'm the one who picked out this information, so if there's information from these books that you think is relevant that I didn't mention, feel free to share it in the comments, but I probably didn't pick it because I personally didn't find it necessary. A lot of these books are focused on the parallel story they're telling, and that isn't incredibly useful to us. It's notable that in the novels, Circus Baby is made out of the fourth Charlie bot. Not only that, but that Charlie bot, implanted with Charlotte Emily's memories and ideas, still kills and consumes Elizabeth Afton, and Elizabeth's soul enters that machine. It's a really interesting concept, where Circus Baby in this novel is essentially a robotic recreation with the memories of Charlotte, but with the soul and memories of Elizabeth. FNAF has talked at length about the implications this might have for the grander story of Five Nights at Freddy's, but that's not what we're here for today. I would recommend those videos though. But what do you make of all of this? What does this information tell you about the FNAF games, or is there any information I left out that you think is important to mention? Feel free to leave it in the comments below. In the meantime, feel free to check out the playlist that I've been accumulating these videos into about making a timeline right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to use #WriteTart. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.